There you go, Mr. Baek. All fresh for the day. Look at that sun, it's almost bright enough to make this place look friendly. For 3 long years, Zulu Maxwell had been a voice in a vacuum. She had bathed the muscular, tattooed frame of Baek Joon Woo, fed him, and shared her deepest insecurities with a man who never offered so much as a blink in return. But when his hand suddenly clamped around her wrist that night, strong, deliberate, and entirely impossible for a quadriplegic, Zulu realized the most dangerous thing in that gold-leafed mansion wasn't the mafia hitman at the gate. It was the lethal truth Baek Joon Woo had been hiding behind his vacant stare. Hey family, I want us to do something real quick. If you love stories about unexpected love, second chances, and finding beauty where the world says it doesn't exist, smash that like button, drop a comment telling me what you think will happen, and subscribe so you never miss these powerful stories. Now, let's begin. Zulu's alarm clock let out a shrill, piercing cry at 5 a.m., just as it had every morning for the last 1,000 days. She silenced the device with a heavy, calloused hand, her joints protesting before her feet even touched the linoleum floor of her cramped studio apartment. The mirror on the back of her door reflected what the world always noticed first: a plus-sized black woman with exhausted eyes and a French maid's uniform that felt like a costume she wasn't allowed to take off. She didn't linger on her reflection, she had long ago learned that looking too closely only brought a familiar, dull ache to her chest. There was simply no point in dreaming when you were invisible. By 6:30 a.m., Zulu was wedged into a bus seat, watching the city grime give way to the manicured, wealthy hills where people of her status were seen as moving furniture. The Baek estate appeared through the morning mist like a jagged obsidian crown. It was a place of sharp angles, black iron gates, and high windows that seemed designed to keep the light out rather than let it in. Inside the master suite, Baek Joon Woo sat in his wheelchair, positioned perfectly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. His silhouette was a study in stillness. The early sun crawled across the colorful, Japanese-style dragon tattoos that coiled around his shirtless torso and arms, making the ink look like it was moving even if he wasn't. To the underbosses and the doctors, he was a statue, a prisoner of a spinal injury that had ended his reign. But his eyes were a different story. Behind that frozen mask, Joon Woo's mind was a humming engine, calculating every betrayal and measuring every threat. He had heard the heavy iron gate groan open. He had tracked the specific, careful rhythm of Zulu's footsteps on the marble floors. In 3 years, she had never been late. She had never been careless with his dignity. Most importantly, she had never looked at the ink on his skin and seen the monster the rest of the world whispered about. "Good morning, Mr. Baek," Zulu's voice called out, preceding her into the room like a warm, steady beam of light. She set her bag down on the velvet settee, rolled up her sleeves, and approached him with the same quiet reverence she had shown since her first day on the job. His face remained a mask of beautiful, terrifying unresponsiveness. Zulu didn't mind the silence. In a world that constantly told her she was too much, his silence was the only place she felt she could truly be herself. She moved to the windows, pulling the heavy drapes back to let the morning sun hit his face. For a split second, she thought she saw a flicker in the dark depths of his pupils, a tiny shift of recognition. But when she turned to face him directly, the paralyzed boss was back to being a statue. He was just a job that kept her rent paid. He was just another person in a life where she was a ghost. What Zulu Maxwell didn't know was that Baek Joon Woo had been counting the seconds of her kindness. And today, his long game of shadows was about to collide with the only person who actually saw him. The bus ride to the hills was a transition from the vibrant, noisy chaos of Zulu's neighborhood to a sterile world of hushed wealth. As the vehicle climbed higher, the air grew thinner and colder, the mist clinging to the lush greenery like a shroud. Zulu sat with her bag clutched to her lap, her knuckles white. She felt the familiar weight of being an outsider, A person whose presence was tolerated only because there were floors to be polished and bodies to be tended to. For Zulu, this wasn't just a job, it was a sanctuary where her invisibility was a requirement rather than a curse. The Baek mansion materialized through the fog, a monolithic structure of dark stone and sharp, unforgiving angles. The black iron gates groaned as they recognized the security clearance on her phone, swinging open to admit her into a world that never seemed to let the light escape. Walking up the long, gravel driveway, Zulu felt the eyes of the silent guards tracking her every move. They didn't see a woman, they saw a service provider, a cog in the machine that kept the statue upstairs functioning. Inside, the silence of the house was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic tick of a grandfather clock in the foyer. The marble floors were cold even through Zulu's shoes as she made her way to the master suite. This had been her path for 3 years, 1,000 days of entering a room where the occupant was as still as the furniture. She pushed open the heavy oak doors to find Baek Joon Woo exactly where he always was, in the center of the room, facing the window. The morning light caught the intricate, colorful tattoos of dragons and flowers that snaked across his back and shoulders, a stark contrast to the clinical stillness of his body. To the world, he was a fallen king, a mafia boss whose power had been stripped away by a spinal injury. But to Zulu, he was the only person who didn't look at her with pity or disgust. "I brought the lavender oil today, Mr. Baek," she said softly, her voice the only thing grounding the room in reality. She began her routine, moving with a grace that belied her size, her hands steady as she prepared the basin for his morning wash. She spoke to him about the weather, the news, and the small, mundane frustrations of her life. She knew he couldn't answer, yet she talked anyway, filling the silence so she wouldn't have to listen to the echoes of her own loneliness. As she worked, she caught her reflection in the gilded mirror above the fireplace, a plus-sized woman in a maid's uniform, her face etched with a fatigue that no amount of sleep could fix. She looked back at Joon Woo, his eyes fixed on the horizon, seemingly empty of thought or emotion. In that moment, the shadow of the hills felt heavier than ever. They were both trapped, one by a body that wouldn't move and the other by a world that wouldn't see her. She didn't realize that behind that mask of paralysis, Joon Woo was listening to every word, his calculating mind recording the tremor in her voice and the gentleness of her touch. The routine was her armor, but today, the first cracks were beginning to show. The routine of the Baek mansion was a sacred, unchanging clock, and Zulu Maxwell was the gears that kept it turning. She knew every detail of Baek Joon Woo's existence, the exact temperature he preferred his green tea and the precise angle his wheelchair needed to be tilted toward the east to catch the rising sun. But routines were also where secrets began to unravel, and for Zulu, the first thread pulled on a Tuesday morning. When she entered the master suite, she stopped short, her breath hitching in her chest. The wheelchair, usually parked with surgical precision against the far wall, was 3 inches to the left of where she had left it the previous night. It was a small, almost invisible shift, but to a woman who had spent 1,000 days measuring her life by the stillness of this room, it was a thunderclap. She stared at Joon Woo, searching his handsome, tattooed face for a sign, but he remained a statue, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if he were miles away. "I must be losing it," she whispered to herself, reorganizing the mahogany bookshelf where she had recently discovered his collection of Korean poetry. As she dusted the spines, her eyes caught on a volume of love poems. She pulled it out, her thumb brushing the worn leather. "Did someone read these to you before the accident, Mr. Baek?" she asked, her voice a soft probe in the heavy silence. There was no answer, but she noticed the slight, sharp intake of his breath, a change so subtle that only someone who had bathed him for years would catch it. The seeds of doubt began to grow into a quiet desperation. That afternoon, while adjusting the pillows behind his head, Zulu leaned in close, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wasn't just a maid anymore, she was a woman hunting for a ghost. I need to ask you something, she murmured, her face inches from his. And I know it sounds crazy, but I think you're in there. I think you've been watching me this whole time. She waited, the silence in the room feeling like a physical weight. Then, as she was about to pull away and dismiss her own paranoia, it happened. His pinky finger, resting against the velvet armrest, moved. It wasn't a muscle spasm or a twitch of gravity, it was a deliberate, singular tap. Zulu stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. The dead weight she had cared for was alive. Oh my God, she breathed, her world tilting on its axis. Baek Joon Woo remained perfectly still, his jaw clenched so tightly that a tiny muscle leaped in his cheek. Inside, he was screaming, his cover blown by a woman who had seen through his 3-year mask. Zulu realized then that she wasn't just caring for a patient, she was living with a man who had chosen to become a ghost, and for the first time, the silence between them felt like a conversation. The following night, the air in the master suite felt charged with a new, heavy electricity. Zulu moved through her tasks with a mechanical precision, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She kept her eyes averted from Baek Joon Woo, terrified that if she looked at him, she would see the ghost of that deliberate finger tap again. He lay in the expansive bed, his eyes closed, his breathing deep and even. To any observer, he was a man lost in the depths of a paralyzed sleep, but Zulu now knew that the silence was a fortress he had built around himself. She waited until the grandfather clock in the hall struck 2 a.m., the sound echoing like a death knell through the hollow mansion. With trembling hands, she approached the mahogany desk in the corner of the room. She had watched his lawyer open the hidden safe behind a false panel once, months ago, thinking Zulu was just a mindless fixture of the room. Her memory, sharpened by years of being overlooked, recalled the digits with startling clarity. The mechanism clicked, a small, sharp sound that felt like a gunshot in the stillness. Inside, there was no stash of drugs or ledgers of blood money. Instead, Zulu's fingers brushed against a worn, black leather journal. She pulled it out, her breath hitching as she retreated to the soft glow of the bedside lamp. The pages were filled with elegant, cramped Korean script, but it was what fell from the back cover that made her world stop. 2 photographs drifted to the floor. Zulu knelt to retrieve them, her vision blurring as she looked at the first image. It was a younger Joon Woo, his face devoid of the cold, calculating mask he wore now. He was smiling, a genuine, radiant expression that reached his eyes. Beside him stood a woman with hair like silk and a laugh frozen in time, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in white lace. The second photo was a jagged contrast, the same woman, pale and translucent in a hospital bed, and a baby in an incubator, surrounded by the cold machinery of a premature life. A soft, choked sound escaped Zulu's throat. She looked at the man in the bed, his tattooed chest rising and falling with agonizing slowness. "You didn't just lose your body," she whispered, the realization cutting deeper than any mafia secret. "You lost your world." She flipped through the journal, seeing dates that ended abruptly 3 years and 2 months ago, right before the accident that had left him a statue. She saw her own name appearing in the later entries, written over and over in the margins of the Korean text. Zulu. 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 The monster of the hills was gone, replaced by a man who had chosen a living death because the pain of being alive was too much to bear. As she tucked the photos back into the journal, she felt a tear splash onto the leather. She wasn't just his maid anymore, and he wasn't just her patient. They were 2 souls drowning in a sea of invisibility, and for the first time, Zulu realized that the dragon on his chest wasn't a warning, it was a shield for a heart that had been shattered long ago. She replaced the journal and closed the safe, unaware that under the covers, Joon Woo's hand had tightened into a white-knuckled fist. The heavy silence of the mansion was shattered at precisely 11:47 p.m. by a sound Zulu had never heard in 3 years, a low, mechanical hum that vibrated through the floorboards. Then came the thud. Red emergency lights began to pulse rhythmically in the hallway, casting long, bloody shadows across the silk wallpaper of the master suite. Automated steel shutters slammed down over the floor-to-ceiling windows with the force of a guillotine, sealing the room into a high-tech tomb. Zulu scrambled to the center of the room, her breath coming in shallow, terrified gasps. Outside the reinforced walls, the distant pop-pop-pop of gunfire echoed through the hills, followed by the screech of tires and the shouting of men in a language she didn't understand. The rival gangs had finally come to collect the head of the fallen dragon. "Mr. Baek," she cried out, her voice cracking as she rushed to the bedside. She reached for his hand, her own fingers trembling violently. "The house, something is happening. The guards aren't answering." She was trapped. The internal lockdown meant no one could enter, but it also meant she couldn't leave. She was a maid with no weapon, no training, and a patient she believed she had to protect with her own life. She sank to the floor beside the bed, pulling her knees to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible. The plus-sized uniform that usually felt like a cage now felt like a target. "I'm so scared," she whispered into the dark, hot tears finally spilling over. "I don't want to die in this house. I don't want to die invisible." Above her, in the suffocating dimness of the red emergency lights, Baek Joon Woo lay as still as death, but his pulse was a thundering war drum. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to vault out of the bed, to draw the Glock hidden beneath the floorboards, and to eliminate the threat at the gate. But more than the tactical threat, it was the sound of Zulu's weeping that tore at his resolve. He watched her through hooded eyes, seeing the way her shoulders shook, the way she clutched her own arms for a comfort no one else would provide. He saw the raw, naked fear of a woman who had spent her life being ignored, now facing the end of it in a room with a man she thought couldn't hear her. He could see the shadows of boots passing under the bedroom door. The internal traitors were guiding the rivals through the bypass codes. They were coming for him, and they would kill the witness at his side without a second thought. Junwoo's jaw set into a line of iron. For 3 years, he had stayed a ghost to save himself. But as he watched Zulu cower in the corner, her heart breaking in the silence, he realized that staying a ghost was no longer an option. The dragon was awake, and the man who had pretended to be a statue was now a predator waiting for the door to burst open. He didn't just want to survive anymore, he wanted to ensure that the woman on the floor was never invisible again. The red emergency lights pulsed like a dying heart, bathing the room in a rhythmic, bloody glow. Zulu remained huddled on the floor, her forehead pressed against the cool mahogany of the bed frame. The muffled sounds of chaos outside were growing closer, the heavy thud of a battering ram against the reinforced hallway doors, the shouting of men who sounded more like butchers than soldiers. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, the sound muffled by her hands. "I'm so sorry I couldn't do more for you, Mr. Baek. I wish I could have seen you smile, just once." She felt a sudden, sharp shift in the air, a movement so subtle it was almost imperceptible. Then, a hand, large, warm, and calloused, descended through the darkness. It didn't twitch, it didn't spasm. It landed with terrifying, intentional weight upon her trembling shoulder. Zulu froze, her breath catching in a throat tight with terror. She didn't dare look up, convinced that the fear had finally fractured her mind. "Zulu." The voice was a low, gravelly rasp, thick with the rust of 3 years of disuse. It was deep and resonant, vibrating through her very bones. Zulu's head snapped up. In the crimson strobing light, she saw him. Baek Joon Woo was no longer staring at the wall. He was looking directly at her, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that felt like a physical heat. His jaw was no longer a frozen line of marble, it was set with a grim, lethal purpose. Zulu, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. You spoke. Don't cry, he said, the words coming more clearly now, though they sounded like they were being dragged over stones. He leaned toward her, his tattooed chest heaving with the effort of breaking his long-held silence. I have heard every word you said to me for 1,000 days. I have felt every touch. I have seen every tear. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. The shame of her vulnerabilities, the secrets she had whispered into the void of his supposed paralysis, and the intimacy of their 3 years together rushed over her. But looking into his eyes, she didn't see the judgment she expected. She saw a mirror of her own pain. She saw a man who had been drowning in his own silence, saved only by the sound of her voice. You're not paralyzed, she breathed, her hand reaching out to touch his face, her fingers grazing the sharp line of his cheekbone. My soul was, he replied, his hand moving from her shoulder to cover hers, pinning it against his skin. But for you, I will stand. He didn't move yet, but the transformation was complete. The statue was gone. The monster the streets feared was gone. In the middle of a war zone, surrounded by enemies who wanted his blood, Baek Joon Woo looked at the woman the world deemed invisible and gave her the only thing he had left, his truth. The silence that had defined their relationship for 3 years hadn't been a wall, it had been a cocoon, and in the red-tinted dark of the lockdown, it had finally split open. Stay behind me, he commanded, his voice growing stronger, reclaiming the authority of a king. No one is taking you from this room. No one is making you invisible ever again. As the bedroom door shuddered under a massive blow, Joon Woo began to shift his weight, his muscles rippling under the dragon ink as he prepared to reveal the miracle he had been hoarding for this very moment. Zulu didn't know if they would survive the next 10 minutes, but as she looked at him, she realized she was no longer afraid. For the first time in her life, she had been truly heard. The bedroom door didn't just open, it disintegrated under the force of a tactical breach. The thunderous crack of wood and metal sent Zulu reeling backward, her hands flying to her ears. Through the haze of splintered oak and the rhythmic, bloody strobe of the emergency lights, 3 figures emerged like wraiths from the underworld. These weren't the street thugs from the gate, they were the architects of the empire's shadows, the underbosses who had sworn fealty to a man they now believed was a hollow shell. Leading them was Kong, a man whose face was a map of old scars and new ambitions. He stepped over the threshold, his heavy boots crunching on the debris, followed by 2 men with leveled weapons. They didn't look at Zulu, to them, she was as significant as the dust motes dancing in the red light. Their eyes were fixed on the bed, on the statue they had come to topple. Look at you, Joon Woo, Kong sneered, his voice dripping with a mix of pity and venom. 3 years we waited for a sign. 3 years we protected a ghost while the family bled. And for what? So you could play house with a servant while you bled the accounts dry into offshore ghost funds? He circled the bed like a shark, the barrel of his suppressed pistol tracing the line of the silk sheets. We know you've been talking to the authorities. We know you're trying to burn the house down from the inside before you crawl into your grave. But a king who can't stand shouldn't be making plans for the future. He finally turned his gaze toward Zulu, who was huddled at the head of the bed, her body acting as a human shield for the man she still desperately wanted to protect. Kang's lip curled in disgust. And you? The faithful shadow. Did you think your silence would buy you a seat at the table? Or are you just as stupid as you look, thinking this piece of meat could ever offer you anything but a violent end? He signaled to one of his men, who stepped forward and grabbed Zulu by the hair, wrenching her away from the bed. A sharp cry of pain escaped her lips as she was forced to her knees on the cold marble. She's seen too much, Kong said casually, as if discussing the disposal of a broken chair. Kill her first. Let our great leader watch his last comfort die before we send him to join his wife. The gunman pressed the cold muzzle of the weapon against Zulu's temple. She closed her eyes, the image of the dragon's journal flashing behind her lids. She wasn't afraid of death as much as she was heartbroken that she would never see Joon Woo truly live. "I'm not a traitor," she whispered, her voice trembling but defiant. "He's more of a man than you'll ever be." Kong laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "A man? He's a statue. And statues don't bleed." "Do it." The gunman's finger tightened on the trigger. The world seemed to slow down, the red light stretching into infinity. But in the heartbeat before the hammer fell, the silence of the room was violated by a sound that shouldn't have been possible. It was the dry, terrifying rasp of leather against leather. "You're wrong, Kong," a voice boomed, no longer a whisper, but a command that carried the weight of 1,000 years of blood. "Statues don't bleed. But dragons do, right before they burn everything you love to ash." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The temperature seemed to drop, and the arrogance on Kang's face vanished, replaced by a primal, soul-deep terror. He turned slowly toward the bed, his weapon trembling. Zulu opened her eyes, gasping as she saw the impossible. Baek Joon Woo wasn't lying down. He was sitting on the edge of the mattress, his tattooed muscles coiling like snakes under his skin, his eyes glowing with a lethal, predatory light that signaled the end of the world for everyone else in the room. The aftermath of the confrontation left the air in the master sweet tasting of ozone and betrayal. Baek Joon Woo had risen from his bed like a vengeful god, his movements fluid and lethal, disarming Kong and his men before the sirens of the state police, alerted by a silent signal he'd planted years ago, began to wail at the gates. But in the chaos of the arrests and the tactical teams swarming the hallways, the intimacy of the bedroom had been replaced by a cold, clinical efficiency. Joon Woo stood by the window, now shirtless and draped in a heavy silk robe that hid the dragon ink but couldn't conceal the sudden, sharp edges of his authority. He wasn't looking at Zulu. He was barking orders into a satellite phone, his voice steady, commanding, and utterly devoid of the warmth that had pulsed through his first whisper. "It's not safe for you here," he said, finally turning to her. His eyes were no longer the mirrors of her pain, they were the hardened tools of a man reclaiming his throne. "My associates are taking over the logistics of the estate. The internal purge has begun, and you are a liability I cannot afford to protect while the foundations are still shaking." Zulu felt a coldness settle in her bones that no fire could warm. "Liability," she whispered, the word tasting like ash. "For 3 years, I was the only person who touched you with kindness. I kept your secrets before I even knew they existed." Joon Woo didn't flinch. He reached into the mahogany desk and pulled out a thick envelope, sliding it across the surface toward her. "There is enough here to ensure you never have to wear a uniform again. You can leave the hills, leave this city. My drivers will take you to a secure location, and from there, you are free." Zulu looked at the envelope, the blood money he'd spent 3 years hiding, and then back at the man she'd started to love. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't just been faking his paralysis to find the traitors, he'd been using her as the perfect camouflage. Who would suspect a ruthless boss of plotting a coup while a simple, invisible maid read him poetry and bathed his skin? She had been his most effective piece of furniture, a human shield of normalcy that kept his enemies complacent. "Was any of it real?" she asked, her voice trembling as she ignored the money. "The way you looked at me in the dark? The way you spoke my name? Or was I just the best hiding place you could find?" Joon Woo's jaw tightened, a flash of something, regret, perhaps, or lingering grief, flickering in his eyes. But he didn't move toward her. He didn't reach for her hand. "You were the only thing that made the silence bearable, Zulu." but the silence is over. And in my world, there is no room for a queen who can be hurt. You don't get to decide what I can handle, she snapped, her pride finally rising above her heartbreak. She didn't take the envelope. She grabbed her bag, her hands shaking as she pulled her thin cardigan over her maid's uniform. You spent 3 years pretending you couldn't move, but it turns out your heart is the only thing that's truly paralyzed. She walked out of the room, her footsteps heavy on the marble floors that had once felt like home. She passed the guards who now bowed to her, but she didn't see them. She only saw the iron gates of the mansion closing behind her as the bus carried her back down into the city fog. As she sat in her cramped studio apartment that night, staring at the empty chair in the corner, Zulu Maxwell realized the cruelest truth of all: she had finally been seen by the man of her dreams, only for him to decide she was a ghost he could no longer afford to keep. The 3 days following her exile were the longest of Zulu's life. She sat in her small apartment, the silence now an enemy rather than a friend. She watched the news with a hollow stomach, seeing reports of internal restructuring and unexplained fires within the Baek corporate sectors. The world saw a business reorganization, Zulu saw a man methodically tearing his own life apart. She received a final, cryptic message on her phone from a hidden number, a digital dump of coordinates and a single line of text in Korean that she had to translate: "The dragon returns to the earth where it began." Zulu knew that location. It was the ancestral estate where Joon Woo's wife and child were buried, a place far more vulnerable than the high-tech fortress in the hills. She realized then that Joon Woo wasn't just dismantling his empire, he was surrendering. He had used his evidence to destroy his enemies, but he had no intention of surviving the fallout. He was choosing to die among his ghosts, believing he was too broken to exist in a world of light. "Not on my watch," Zulu whispered, her voice cracking with a new, fierce resolve. She didn't have a flashy car or a tactical team. She had her savings, a heavy coat, and the sheer, stubborn will of a woman who refused to let the only person who truly saw her slip away. She took a long-distance bus and then walked 3 miles through the biting wind until she saw the silhouette of the old estate. The security was gone. The gates stood ajar, swinging mournfully in the breeze. Zulu pushed through them, her breath coming in ragged plumes of white. She found him in the overgrown garden, sitting in a simple wooden chair near the 2 marble headstones she had seen in the photographs. He wasn't wearing his silk robes or his expensive suits. He wore a simple black sweater, his tattooed hands resting limply on his knees. A group of men, the remnants of Kang's loyalists who had escaped the purge, were emerging from the shadows of the trees, their weapons drawn. They looked like scavengers ready to feast on a fallen king. Joon Woo didn't even turn his head. He looked ready to welcome the end. "Joon Woo." Zulu's voice tore through the frigid air, stopping the gunmen in their tracks. She marched into the center of the clearing, her plus-sized frame a solid, unyielding wall between the assassins and the man she loved. Joon Woo's head snapped up, his eyes widening in genuine shock. "Zulu? What are you doing? I told you to stay away. And I told you that you don't get to decide what I can handle," she shouted back, ignoring the guns pointed at her chest. She turned to face him, her eyes burning with a mix of fury and devotion. "You think you're a martyr? You think dying here makes you a hero to the family you lost? It doesn't. It just makes you a coward who's leaving me behind. You're in danger because of me," he rasped, his voice breaking as he tried to stand, his legs still shaky from the years of feigned disuse. "I've been in danger since the day I was born into a world that wanted me to be invisible," Zulu countered, stepping closer until she could smell the scent of pine and grief on his skin. She grabbed his hand, her fingers interlocking with his. "You gave me a name. You gave me a voice. Now you stand up and you fight for the life we're supposed to have." If you want to die, you're going to have to watch them kill me first. The leader of the gunmen stepped forward, a sneer on his face. Moving sentiment. We'll happy to accommodate you both. Joon Woo looked at Zulu, at the woman who had broken back into a world of monsters just to tell him he was worth saving. Something in his gaze shifted. The paralyzed heart finally thawed. He gripped Zulu's hand back with that same impossible, deliberate strength she had felt that first night. Step back, Zulu, he commanded, but this time, the tone was different. It wasn't an exile, it was a promise. He stood up, his height dwarfing the men approaching him. The dragon ink on his arms seemed to glow in the twilight. He wasn't a statue, and he wasn't a ghost. He was a man who finally had something to live for. As the first gunman lunged, Joon Woo moved with a terrifying, graceful violence, pulling Zulu behind him. He wasn't just defending a throne anymore, he was defending his queen. The violent echoes of the old estate faded into the past, replaced by the rhythmic, eternal sigh of the ocean. The black iron gates and blood-stained marble floors were a world away now, traded for a small wooden house with whitewashed walls that sat on a shore where the sand was as warm as a summer afternoon. Baek Joon Woo stood at the edge of the water, his bare feet sinking into the wet earth as the tide ebbed away. He was no longer the dragon of the hills, and he was certainly no longer a statue. He was simply a man, dressed in a loose linen shirt that caught the salt breeze, his gaze fixed on the horizon not with calculation, but with a profound, quiet peace. The ink on his arms was still there, but the stories they told were different now, no longer warnings of death, but reminders of a life he had fought to reclaim. He heard the soft crunch of footsteps behind him and didn't need to turn to know who it was. The rhythm was as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. Zulu walked toward him, her colorful sundress billowing around her legs, her hair free and caught in the wind. She didn't look like an invisible maid, and she didn't look like a liability. She looked like the queen of the quiet kingdom they had built together in the sun. "The tea is ready," she said, her voice warm and steady, the same voice that had kept him tethered to reality for 3 years of darkness. Joon Woo turned, his face breaking into a smile that was no longer a rare miracle, but a daily occurrence. He reached out, his hand finding hers with that same strong, deliberate grip that had changed everything that first night in the mansion. He pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers as they stood in the surf. "I was just thinking," he murmured, his voice deep and clear. "About how I used to watch you from that wheelchair. How I used to wonder what kind of woman would stay so long for a man who gave her nothing but silence." Zulu laughed, a bright, melodic sound that joined the chorus of the seagulls. "And I was wondering when the man behind the mask would realize he was worth staying for." They had left it all behind, the money, the power, and the blood-soaked legacy. Joon Woo had used the last of his influence to dismantle the syndicate from the roots, ensuring that no one would come looking for the ghost of the boss or the woman who had saved him. They were nobodies here, and to them, that was the greatest luxury of all. In this distant corner of the world, Zulu wasn't too much and Joon Woo wasn't not enough. "Look," Zulu whispered, pointing down at the sand. Behind them, 2 sets of footprints stretched back toward their home, side by side and deeply etched into the shore. As the next wave rolled in, the water surged forward, gently smoothing the sand until the tracks vanished completely. "They're gone," Joon Woo said, tightening his hold on her hand. "Good," Zulu replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "The past is for the tide. The truth is right here." They stood together as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet. For 3 years, they had been 2 people trapped in their own versions of invisibility, but as they walked back toward their house, fingers intertwined, they weren't ghosts anymore. They were finally, fully seen. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in a mansion isn't the truth being hidden, it's the love that refuses to let that truth die. And as the stars began to peek through the twilight, Zulu Maxwell and Baek Joon Woo realized that they hadn't just found a way to survive, they had finally found a way to live. What would you do for a love that sees the real you? Would you walk through fire to save someone who had lived a lie? If this journey touched your heart, don't forget to like this story and share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more emotional stories of second chances and unexpected queens. Remember, you are never invisible to those who truly care. You are seen. You are valued. And you are always enough.